suffering and imperfection and a sort of chaos are features and not bugs of the universe. And I think it's the same exact sort of distinction between being scientific and being scientistic. When someone is scientific, it's to recognize that through our senses we can make reasonable observations that advance our understanding of the universe in general. Some of its very basic, principal components and rules. Whereas to be scientistic, on the other hand, is to take the belief in this ability to the extreme and kind of in a similar way apply it to utopian thinking and belief that we can master and fully comprehend the universe when, just like people I mentioned will actively reject an understanding of their human nature in themselves, so too will the universe do that. The universe, as soon as we think we understand it in its whole, in a perfect way, it'll change everything about itself just to prove that we don't and can't understand it in a holistic way.
Yes.
We hear a lot of people nowadays say the famous facts don't care about your feelings. And that may be true, but the inverse is as well. Feelings don't care about your facts.
Yes.
If someone has an experience that is not explainable within the realm of empiricism and realism and the scientifically explainable, they're not just going to act as though that experience didn't happen, right? That's the thing about idealism, is that the universe is so linked with the phenomenon of human being, right? That, humans exist in the universe as far as we know, really the only processors of it. People, in my view, are these little nodes of consciousness and agency, linked with one another, and it's sort of our role, our function in the universe to act as a processor of all that's out there. We're perceptual agents first and foremost, and all the material reality, the universe, scientifically speaking, is in a sense meaningless and may as well be non-existent without us here to perceive and engage and change it. And there's a thinker named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. My French is awful, so I apologize to you if I butchered the pronunciation. But he has a law of complexity consciousness, which talks about as material reality, goes on in time, it complexifies, in on itself and with itself, eventually causing the emergence of consciousness. And consciousness, in turn, engages with that material reality and further complexifies it as the consciousness grows in its depth and its nature. And I think we're along that ride right now in the history of the universe. I think it's a pattern, it's a general rule that hasn't been broken thus far. And I think part of the goal of creative politics and integrating mysticism with realism is understanding the complexity of the systems around us and our role in it and the limitations that we have right now as knowledge seeking and processing entities.
Yes. That's a very good point, and I'm happy that you kind of closed on that, because that's where I wanted to go.
Theorem Sorokin, one of the founders of kind of modern sociology, described, familialistic relationships between people as relationships where the border between two individuals, two eyes, dissolves, and there's the formation of a single solid we. And I think exploring how those relationships, those familial, solid, common, loving, altruistic relationships form between people and communities needs to be the foremost objective. It's been called amitology before, this study of mutual aid and cooperation. And the left-right spectrum doesn't do a good job of placing where this study lies, because you described yourself as, if I remember correctly, on the political left, if you had to choose a label. I'd probably describe myself as being more on the political right, but we have this common interest in figuring out what makes systems unified. The physical space that people occupy is really, really important in regards to sociality. You need social infrastructure in place where people can bind as members of a common community. Places like coffee shops and libraries and public parks, where people feel engaged with the people that live around them. And unfortunately, most of our major urban centers were designed, or at least exploded, in this modern period, and we weren't concerned about how the architecture around us was going to influence the way we relate to one another. But we're coming to realize more and more that it's really, really important. And so building on the outskirts, like you said, building in these places where the state doesn't have the same sort of infrastructural and despotic power, places like the mountains, forests, deserts that you mentioned, are going to be prime areas to kind of restructure community living centers in ways that foster and maximize our altruistic and communal tendencies.
Yes.
Because once you have a population likely under Dunbar's number of people who have common values, common culture and identity, and then form them and place them in a space, in infrastructure and architecture that fosters their continual connection and growth in the relationship between one another, that's when almost any political system would probably work. You can have markets and you can have communal sharing. And that project is rooted in things like breaking bread together. You mentioned the importance of sharing a meal in a lot of communities, and that goes back to people can gather the individual components and ingredients and dishes themselves, but bringing them together and having a space where they can come together and have a communal meal is critical to forming long-lasting, sustainable communities. And so current cities are, in my opinion, going to need to be drastically redesigned if they're going to be sustainable and healthy living places. And then on the outskirts, we're going to see these experimental projects in local government, in self-sustainable agriculture and economies, and where people have the freedom of movement and the radical freedom of association to form communities that align with what they want and they prioritize. And whether that be on the left or the right, I think we're going to see all sorts in this pluralist, localist system.
No, I fully agree. I think the dilemma is to find something that's, as you said, flexible, smart, and that's the way toward efficiency.
And I think that we're going to see that in local governments. That people are going to increasingly realize that their own local governments can cover the vast majority of the needs, and that there will be more political flexibility in the different policies, in the different ways of organization. There's the old adage that everyone's a communist in their own home, and I think it can extend a little bit beyond your own home, just the logic that we give more, we're more charitable and more altruistic towards the people who are both physically and socially closer to us. And so if our entire pension system isn't run nationally but locally, people might be more willing to give into it and to have a little more redistributive sharing going on. Pretty much any form of taxation, people know where that money's going. They can see it. It's tangible to them. They know the people who it's helping. They know they themselves are using the services that the money is being put towards. And going back to experimentation, local governments can, it's easier to move between cities than between countries. So if cities have radically different policies and politics going on, it's easier for people to move between those to find where they best integrate than it is to move between countries, because voting with your feet is real, but it requires a certain amount of positive liberty, a certain amount of funds and material resources to make it happen that too many people around the world don't have.
So, especially if we're talking about big nations like the United States, right? Because here, where I live, it's pretty easy to vote with your feet. We're in the east of France, right? So you want to go in Luxembourg, you can. You can go work in Germany, etc., etc. But that's not reasonable to expect if you're in the center of the United States, right? Because where do you go? The United States, or the United States? It's not a real choice, right?
No, it certainly is not. And you see things arising like e-citizenship around the world. I think Estonia is kind of the leader in that, where you can become a virtual citizen of a country and, be able to pay your taxes to them by a voluntary decision. And as much as sometimes I hate the label, usually the best label I use for myself is libertarian. But I have a lot of problems with libertarianism, as I'm sure people who listen to this conversation will see are rather evident. But that principle that voluntary interaction and consent is the first guiding principle for our ethics is something that I firmly subscribe to. So finding these ways in which people can voluntarily enter themselves into a social contract is important. There's the joke, oh, I never signed the social contract. Show me where I put it with a pen, that I wanted to be a United States citizen. It doesn't work that way. We're born where we're born. But the prospect of being able to opt in voluntarily to different systems of governance means that we can have states without coercion and force, that we can have civil society without the state institutions involved.
Yes.
Or at the very least involuntary state institutions. I'm sure lots of people would call a voluntary system of local taxes a state all the same, even though it doesn't match the Weberian definition.
Yes.
And if we can just see, I don't want to say a return of city-states, but of more local or regional areas in which people could flow freely between places as they choose, is going to be really, really important, because freedom of association, in my opinion, is probably the most important right that a human being could have. And freedom of movement is a very necessary instrument and tool to utilize your freedom of association. If you can't go to the place and to the people with whom you wish to associate, then the right is meaningless. So the two are definitely a good combo and a necessary pair.
Absolutely, yes. I think you phrased it well.
I think at the core what we're talking about here is reconceptualizing the state and asking, can we have society? Can we have civil society and community and cooperative social systems that don't fall under the coercive and violent and forceful definition of the state? And I'm optimistic enough to say, yes, I think it's possible, but it's certainly a long and difficult and complex process. I think going back to the discussion about modernity and how one of the defining characteristics of modernity was enthusiasm. There were a lot of examples throughout the 20th century and into the 21st for that matter, where states, by virtue of their force, have done terrible things in the name of noble goals. So I'm sympathetic to the old, saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think a lot of the political systems we saw, communist ones, fascist ones alike, were rooted in good intentions, but the enthusiasm of what was going on in that period of history and the overestimated beliefs of what humankind and the state is capable of, particularly what the state is capable of as an entity, led to terrible things. And I think we're now in the point in our historical and political and social development to start asking what is done best without a forceful, coercive state, and then asking ourselves, what can we do to make people pay into systems like a pension system voluntarily? And that goes back to our discussion about creative politics and how we need to explore what makes people altruistic, what makes them see fellow members of the community as a we and not two distinct atomized I's. Because once we figure that out, we can start to pave the ways for these voluntary, stateless civil societies. And I think you mentioned experimentation. I think we're going to see a political pluralism where there's a lot of different political and economic systems, maybe some on the along the lines of like a primitive communism others engaging fully in mercantile activities and having a robust free market with businesses and in urban areas. I think we're going to see all sorts of small-scale government experiments and kind of almost art projects arise around the world. Eric Weinstein, for example, talks about the embedded growth obligation in a lot of our systems, where our economies and the way that our countries operate is all centered around continual, perpetual, infinite growth that will keep making more money, having more resources, creating more jobs for more people. But unfortunately, history and progress isn't a perfect linear line upwards. It's certainly not a big exponential one. It's going to have to go down in some way. It kind of either goes in waves or almost like a cyclical fashion that generally trends upwards. And right now, I think we need to be asking, yes, even if cities are the best way to spur growth, is growth the number one priority in what we're looking for? Or is sustainable, meaningful, happy, loving communities what we want to strive for? Because if so, we have to question what the role of the current city as we know it is, and how we can reintegrate it in a healthy fashion if we want to see that in the future. And this goes to one of my favorite thinkers that we're finally looping back to, Petiram Sorokin. And he talks about the historical cycle. And so as a fan of history, I'm glad that you appreciated that throughout the course of our history, we need times of not necessarily decay and decline, but disintegration and reintegration of different ways of thinking, of different cultural values and ways of viewing the world and ourselves as beings. And right now, modernity is very much, as I said, the era of the human senses. It is the sensate era where everything's about what we feel and touch and see and hear, which has led to scientism on one hand, and a lot of sentimentalism on the other. But the shared feature is that belief in growth and utopian progress, that things are only going to go upwards from here in history. That's where we kind of get offshoots like Fukuyama's argument of the end of history, with kind of the triumph of neoliberal, homogenized global capitalism, right? Or corporatism, rather. And soon, though, we're in the twilight years of that sensate era, and there's a renewed interest in things that we talked about, like mysticism and spirituality, the non-material parts and the complex, hard to understand parts of human beings and the universe that we live in. And just because we're not throwing away, science and its value and technology and its value, but we're putting it aside for a second and looking back to these perennial wisdoms, these old truths from traditional societies, things that we can learn from that worked right before, that maybe we can reintegrate, right? So modernity was a giant creative process. It was progress. Then we see things like postmodernism, which was at its core deconstructive. It was disintegrating how we thought about the system of modernity. And now we're once again back at that process of regeneration and reintegrating. And it's up to us how we put the puzzle pieces, how we put the pieces back together to form a better society. But we have to recognize we can't take everything from modernity into the future and expect a different result. We have to look to the pre-modern and the traditional. We have to take parts of the modern and we have to take parts of the postmodern insight as well and try and form something a little more coherent than we had before. And it's my opinion, as it sounds like you might agree, that exploring what makes people social, communal, altruistic beings is going to be the foremost task in putting the pieces back together in a productive and creative way.
And I'm going to disagree a little bit. I don't know how I don't know if we're in the twilight years of the neoliberal state, right? Because it is that powerful. I think we've kind of lost even the perspective of the scale of how powerful the so-called liberal state is, right? And the biggest demonstration of it is how it literally wiped the floor with everything else, right? It wiped the floor with the monarchies. It wiped the floor with the other cultures all around the world. It wiped the floor with fascism, with communism, etc. So I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I love this conversation. So I like the pushback a lot because it is hard to see, especially as an American on the inside, how we can see this American-led kind of neoliberal global order come to an end. It really does seem
Yes.
to be eternal to a lot of people. But what we have to realize is that, yes, you're right. This kind of capitalist, pseudo democratic, kind of mixed way of thinking has dominated modernity. It came out the winner in the tournament. It beat communism and socialism in the long run. It beat out fascism pretty much right away. It made things like feudalism and kind of old style mercantilism mixed with monarchy, made them outdated. And so we say, well, what's left at this point?
Yes.
But just because it came out as the winner of the three political theories of modernity doesn't mean that it's going to be the winner at the end of the day. I think right now, as I said, we're in a reintegrative, a reconstructive process. And
Yes.
part of that's going to be developing this political theory that's new and that is beyond liberalism or communism or fascism or any of them, and it's going to be looking more broadly back in history and towards the future to see what it needs to and can integrate to be a more inclusive political theory beyond left and right, capitalism and communism. And one of my favorite poems is Ozymandias, right? And in summary, it talks about this, great king who builds up this mighty monument to himself to talk about his greatness and how great his empire is, and to show just how eternal it can be. But the message of the poem comes at the end when it says, nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. So it's showing they're in the middle of the desert with nothing around is what remains of this once great empire who thought so highly of itself. And the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I think when you have every other major power in the world, every other major way of thinking is now oppositional to you, it's hard to see how you stay in power.
How exactly do you prevent the bigger Leviathan from swallowing the other, right? Which is in its interest.
Yeah.
Which is in its interest.
Yes, that is the major problem with localism that I find, is from a realist perspective, there's nothing to stop, someone who does want to form a big state or an empire, who has the means and resources and might to do so, from just taking over all the rest and subjugating them. You can make an argument for a robust series of local, defense, like militias of a sort, just localized defense as well as the localized political and economic systems. But at the end of the day, all it takes, like you said, is one big player, one bully to come and ruin the whole setup. And that's a question I haven't figured a way around. I think it's the question that any global thinker would probably put into mind is, let's say Europe or the United States becomes this kind of hyper pluralist local series of local governments. What's to stop China or Russia from just coming in and gaining influence over the whole kind of split up division of territories? I don't know. I'm not particularly concerned with that question at the moment. I guess we'll figure it out when we come to it, right? That's the fun of this all. There's fun and chaos and experimentation and revitalization, and I'm excited to see where the next couple decades take us on this issue, because I'm optimistic despite recognizing some obvious flaws in the long term. Naive optimism, right? or self-aware naive optimism. I'm self-aware about acting naive. Yeah.
Is it really naive?
That's the question. It's kind of like, are you really crazy if you think you're crazy? Yeah.
Mm, mm,
Matter of
mm.
debate for sure, but